All right, y'all. One of the most important things about the Wild West, one of the things that allowed Manifest Destiny to become a reality, is the railroads. Okay? Now, we tend to think of cowboys and settlers going out alone on their own horses all the way from, out east in New York or something and ended up in California. That is not the way it happened. Okay? Either caravans of settlers like the Donners came out in huge trains of, not literal trains, but trains of wagons, or the thing that really sped up the settling of the Wild West was the railroad. There was a competition amongst several railroad companies, and the federal government was offering something like $10 million to the first company that can establish a railroad that stretched from the East Coast to the West Coast. That was achieved in 1869 at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. This is right above Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake, and it is just west of Salt Lake City. Okay, so it's really out in the middle of nowhere. What happened was the Eastern Railroad Company and the Western Railroad Company came in and they laid the last spike. Okay, so this is the completion of the transcontinental. Trans means across, okay? Continental, root word is continent, so the across the continent railroad, basically. All right, so this made it possible for millions of settlers to get out west cheaply. Can you imagine the expenses of getting a bunch of wagons together and 8 or 9 months of food and going across dangerous Indian-filled territory? And not to mention the cost, but the death, the hardships along the way. This made it safe for families for the first time to move out west, and at a cost that was much cheaper. $40 for a ticket from Nebraska to California, okay? That's halfway across the country. But don't be fooled, that sounds like a cheap price, but it's not that cheap, because back then people made about $1 a day on average. So in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah, there was a big party. They drove a giant golden spike, okay? Well, not giant, but it's about that big, 6-inch spike, into the ground. It was the last spike that connected the railroad, okay? Now, later on that day, after the party was over, they actually took the spike out of the ground and they replaced it with a fake spike, okay? So the first spike was real gold, 24 karat, solid gold. That spike is actually in a college right now in California, if I'm not mistaken. So the only thing that's left at Promontory Point, if you go there today, is a replica of that spike. So like I said, it's out kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's really cool. When you go there today, there's actually the two locomotives are still there facing each other, okay? These are probably replicas of the originals, or they found the originals and refurbished them, but they actually run, okay? They have steam coming out of them, and you could go there and take pictures, and there's a visitor center where you can buy souvenirs. I bought myself a little fake golden spike, from Promontory Point, Utah. But it's a cool thing if you're going out west and you're interested in the history. This place is still out there. It's still available to go to, okay? So, question on the test, where did the Transcontinental Railroad get completed? It's Promontory Point, Utah, 1869. And that allowed millions of settlers to move west. All right, so how did they get there? How did the government make sure Manifest Destiny happened? Well, the government had a very big interest in getting as many settlers out west as possible to populate this new area of America. But they had to get them out there, so they used the railroads, okay? So from 1870 to 1890, the railroad mileage increased from 53,000 to 190,000 miles. That's 4 times as much, okay? In 20 years, the railroads grew by 4 times. To finance this expansion, the government subsidized railroad companies. Do y'all remember that word subsidy? When the government pays you to either do something or not to do something. So here's what they did. They received congressional land grants. Now, what the government told the railroads is this: for every 1 mile of track that you build, Okay, for every bit of track you build, you get a mile of land on either side, on both sides of that track for free. So think about how much land you could get. If you built 10 miles worth of track, you now own 20 square miles worth of land. Now, to pay for all this, or to help them go farther, what they would do is the railroads sold the land, some of the land. Every once in a while, in all these acres of land that they own, they would sell a big chunk of it right next to the railroad tracks. And the settlers that were using the railroads to get out west would actually hop on a train, and then they would go out to these places, buy their land, or use the Homestead Act, and get their own little piece apart from the railroads. And then they would be the customers of the railroad. So it's a brilliant move by the government. You give away land to the railroads build themselves for basically no cost to the government, except for land that is stolen from the Indians. And then you sell the land to customers that will use the railroads constantly and finance the future of the railroads. So they paid back the government by lowering shipping costs, the railroads did, and by World War II, roughly, they had paid back all of the value of the land, pretty much. So, here we go, the next thing, okay? So, the railroad had major scheduling problems, okay? So, back then, we didn't have what's called time zones. Okay? Back then, you would use a tool called a sundial. You would go and put it in the sun, and the shadow of the sun would tell you what time it is. Well, the problem is there's no standardization of time. So if you go 10 miles to the west or to the east, you get a slightly different time. Well, that doesn't seem like that big of a deal until you're trying to keep a schedule across an entire continent. So if San Francisco says that the train is leaving at 10 o'clock in the morning, well, if you're in New York City, which is all the way across the country, and you go outside at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's a much different time than 10 o'clock in San Francisco. Okay, you're actually talking about 4 hours off. So to schedule the railroads, to make sure trains would not collide when using the same tracks, or to make sure that you wouldn't miss your train, Professor C.F. Dodd proposes that we divide the Earth up into 24 time zones because there are 24 hours in the day. Okay? So, if you divide the Earth into 24 time zones, there's 360 degrees in a circle. So 360 divided by 24 gets you 15 degrees of longitude. Okay, those are those lines that divide the Earth up, each time zone. So, and that's why here in Louisiana, we have the same time as, let's say, places in Mississippi and some places in Texas, okay? But it's also the same reason why California is 2 hours ahead of us, okay? No, 2 hours behind us, I'm sorry, okay? So, anyway, in 1883, railroads adopt what's called rail time, which is what Professor Dodd was talking about. And the purpose of going to time zones and rail time was to coordinate the railroad schedule. That's the answer on the test. Now, if you notice, you see how coordinate railroads is in bold. I am pointing out to you what the answer on the test is going to be, okay? So here's the question. What's the purpose of standard time or rail time, okay? And the answer is to coordinate railroad schedules and to make sure trains don't crash into each other. In 1918, look at this. This is 40 years later. The government was kind of sluggish to adopt rail time, but 40 years later, they finally admitted that Professor Dodd had a good idea, and the government of the United States adopted standard time, rail time, as standard time as well. Okay? That's why we have time zones. All right. Let's see what else. What's next? All right. We'll go ahead and cut it off right there for now. I'll see you in the next video.